Buddhism for Today, The Essential Wisdom of the Threefold Lotus Sutra by Nikkyo Niwano. Preface. The Lotus Sutra is not difficult to understand. In East Asian Buddhism today, it is widely believed that the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wonderful Dharma, more commonly known as the Lotus Sutra, is the finest of all the sutras. Despite this belief, people assume that the teachings of the Buddha are very difficult to understand. I think one of the main reasons is that, at first glance, Buddhist sutras appear quite intimidating because the versions of the text available to us today are filled with challenging words and unfamiliar language. If we take a look at commentaries on the Lotus Sutra, we will be disappointed to discover that they are often little more than verbatim restatements of the literal meaning of the original text. On top of this, the Lotus Sutra abounds with scenes that come across as dreamscapes or mythical stories, and it also contains quite a bit of philosophical Buddhist jargon. All this leaves us with the impression that the Lotus Sutra is strange or mysterious, and perhaps even out of touch with reality. Consequently, most people give up on the Lotus Sutra because they find it esoteric and incomprehensible, or they dismiss it as some sort of fantasy with no relevance to today's world. But the Lotus Sutra was not so difficult for people to understand when the sutra first appeared. The person we call the Buddha, or Awakened One, was born Siddhartha Gautama, whom history knows as a sage of the Shakya clan, or Shakyamuni. During his lifetime in the 5th or 4th centuries BCE, he was not a mysterious figure who spoke in riddles like an entranced medium, nor did he force dogmatic ideas on others. Shakyamuni was a conscientious person who thought long and hard about questions such as the nature of our world and what human beings are. As a corollary to these considerations, he also deeply pondered the problem of how human beings should live in this world and what a harmonious society should look like. At the end of this quest, Shakyamuni discovered a universal truth applicable to any time, place, or person. A truth that is a universal one should, by definition, be easy for people to understand. For example, we might consider something like dividing 1 by 3, which results in 1/3. This is a universal mathematical truth that anyone can understand. Like this simple math problem, a universal truth is never something we have to believe with blind faith because we cannot understand it rationally. But we are not able to make heads or tails of even such an apparently obvious truth until we reach a certain age or level of intellectual development. The Rissho University professor and mathematician Yoichi Yoshida writes about this in his book of essays on mathematics. When Yoshida learned decimals in the 3rd or 4th grade of elementary school, he came across repeating decimals, such as 1 divided by 3 equals 0.3333 repeating, which is a calculation that cannot be perfectly completed and therefore repeats forever. But when he actually attempted to fold a piece of paper in 3 equal parts, he was able to divide the paper perfectly. I don't get this, he thought. When using decimals, dividing 1 by 3 without any remainder is logically impossible, but when you actually try to do so in real life, it is possible. As we might expect of a future mathematician, Yoshida gave serious thought to this mystery, and later, in the 5th or 6th grade, when he learned fractions, he was taught the fractional number 1/3. Fractions gave Yoshida a new way of looking at the problem. When he first learned that it was indeed possible to divide 1 by 3 using fractions with no leftover, he felt as if he had been played for a fool earlier. Yoshida took a liking to fractional numbers, however, and tried hard to imagine 1/3 not just as a fraction, but also as a whole number without a repeating decimal. Thanks to this experience, Yoshida eventually came to understand why the ability to fold a piece of paper in 3 equal parts is no mystery at all. The Buddha Dharma is just like this. Fundamentally, it's something anyone can learn, but truly understanding it requires mature faith and continued effort. Even with mathematics, it might sound like a good idea to start with learning a more advanced arithmetic that you can do many operations with, like fractions. Yet, if you jump directly to teaching fractions to 1st or 2nd graders, they will only end up confused. For this reason, teachers begin with whole numbers such as 1, 2, 3, and so on, and after that, they go on to teach fractions to their young students. On the other hand, instead of trying to teach 1/3 through an abstract approach, teachers can directly demonstrate it to children in a concrete, practical way by folding a sheet of paper in 3 equal parts. Shakyamuni taught the people of his day in just this way. He explained the Dharma according to his listeners' ability and degree of understanding, using all sorts of ways to explain his teachings, such as parables or stories that illustrated truths, including the principle of causation. Because of these methods, the people of Shakyamuni's time understood him well. It would be premature to conclude, just by glancing over the text of the Lotus Sutra, that its pages contain some kind of unrealistic fantasy world that cannot be taken seriously. If we grasp the essence of the Lotus Sutra, we will realize that it is replete with thoroughly modern, scientific, and humanistic truths. I would like to stress that, because of his methods, the people of Shakyamuni's day absorbed his teachings quite easily, and those teachings profoundly transformed their lives. If this were not the case, there is no way so many people would have wholeheartedly devoted themselves to Shakyamuni and his teachings during the short, less than 50-year span of time that he disseminated the Dharma. Shakyamuni's group, the Sangha, was an extremely free and open religious community. The Lotus Sutra's Departure of the 5,000, a scene that appears in Chapter 2, Skillful Means, is a case in point. Some 5,000 prideful and arrogant disciples, who assume they were already enlightened, stand up and leave the Dharma assembly all at once, but Shakyamuni does not try to stop them. Although he never forced people to join the Sangha, and did not prevent anyone from leaving, the number of people devoted to Shakyamuni and his teachings rapidly grew to tens of thousands. This increase was certainly owing to Shakyamuni's unparalleled ability to inspire and persuade, but more important, it was because his teachings were highly esteemed and also easily understood. The One Buddha Vehicle. Shakyamuni's absolute commitment to freedom caused trouble for a time after his passing, however. His parting instructions to his disciples amounted to only a few words. All things are impermanent, remain diligent. Shakyamuni said absolutely nothing about who should lead his religious community or how it should be led. The remaining disciples, left with the task of preserving his teachings, were organized naturally according to geographic region, but, because the teachings had not been standardized, interpretations differed from group to group and region to region across the vast Indian subcontinent. Although the Dharma had been properly understood and transmitted in places where Shakyamuni himself had taught, people received the teachings differently where others shared them while adding their own ideas. Divergent interpretations were not only a function of differing places and messengers, but also an issue of time. During Shakyamuni's life, and for some years following his passing, the teachings retained their original vitality, but over time, they gradually lost their true essence and eventually came to be handed down in form only. The Buddhist community's initial troubles were not limited to the century or two after Shakyamuni's passing. We could say that such challenges have continued for 2,500 years, right up to the present. From the standpoint of an eternal, universal truth, 2,500 years is just the blink of an eye. In the transmission of Buddhism from China to Japan, the Buddha Dharma often saw a rising tide of living dynamism whenever an eminent or famous monk appeared. Sadly, in nearly every case, this tide soon slipped silently back out to sea. Nichiren, whom many people believe breathed new life into Japanese Buddhism, was one of the most outstanding of these figures. With the passage of time after his death, his teachings were also distorted, however, eventually becoming a mere empty shell. As mentioned above, after the passing of Shakyamuni, the interpretation of his teachings in India began to vary from region to region and from group to group. Monastics, in particular, tried to secure their own authority by teaching and cultivating ways of practice that were impossible for lay people to follow. Yet, as the Lotus Sutra demonstrates time and time again, while Shakyamuni was alive, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen all practiced spiritual disciplines side by side, listened to Shakyamuni's expositions together, and cooperated in spreading the Dharma. Somewhere along the way, however, monastics and lay people became estranged. I surmise that this rift opened up because among the monastic disciples, some came to place more emphasis on keeping the letter of the precepts, the guidelines about behavior and lifestyle for followers of Buddhism, than on upholding their spirit. In other words, the cause of the problem was that appearances had become more important than substance. Some monastics also took Shakyamuni's practical teachings about how best to live life and worked them into impenetrable systems of philosophy in order to oppose the other traditions of learning that were popular in India during those years. Over time, some Buddhists also adopted the position that it was not possible to lead all people to Buddhahood, as Shakyamuni had taught. These people maintained that we couldn't possibly become as great as the Buddha. Instead, they concluded that it was enough to simply liberate ourselves from suffering and distress in this world. Believing that Buddhism had lost its dynamism, other practitioners of the Buddha's teachings became convinced that this situation was unacceptable. A passionate desire arose within them to return to what they saw as the true principles of Shakyamuni. This gave rise to new groups, the Mahayana Buddhist communities. Mahayana means the great vehicle, because the community saw their teachings as an excellent vehicle or method for reaching the realm of the Buddha. At times, the proponents of Mahayana belittled the status quo's prevailing thought as the lesser vehicle, the Hinayana, an inferior vehicle. The older status quo community responded in kind by labeling the Mahayana inauthentic Buddhism. In this fashion, the two communities became severely polarized. During the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, a sutra appeared that taught that there was no greater or lesser vehicle, but only one vehicle, Ekayana. The text encouraged both sides to give up their family quarrel and follow the single vehicle together. The same sutra also stated that when Shakyamuni delivered it, he declared it to be his finest teaching, the teaching of truth. This sutra was none other than the Lotus Sutra. Invitation to explore the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra's revitalization of Buddhism occurred some 700 years after the passing of the Buddha. But to me, the changes Buddhism went through during those centuries represent a recurring pattern of transformation that has continued throughout the 2,500-year history of Buddhism. I see great significance in this pattern for those of us living today. By the 20th century, Japanese Buddhism in particular had once again lapsed into form lacking function, the vitality needed to liberate people. I believe it is the deep and profound intention of the Buddha to once again revitalize his teachings through a movement of lay practitioners. We can now witness this revival across Japan and in other countries, as drives to breathe new life into the Buddha's teachings are rising like a new tide across the world. The people of Europe and the Americas are looking to Buddhism for new sources of wisdom. Buddhism has also experienced a revival in the People's Republic of China and in other parts of Asia. This is truly a critical time. If the people of this world fail to reflect on the sanctity of human life and return to a way of living that sustains both themselves and others, in essence, if they fail to return to the teachings of the Buddha, before long the human race is likely to destroy itself. At this critical time, what weighs on me most is that the Lotus Sutra, the greatest teaching of the Buddha, is still considered so difficult for people to understand that it has become either an object of research for a small clique or the exclusive possession of specialists in the study of religion. Many people in Japan and around the world are unfamiliar with the content of the Lotus Sutra, and even fewer understand or appreciate its message. For this reason, it has been difficult for the wisdom of the Lotus Sutra to find its way into people's lives. I wrote this book for 2 reasons. The first is that I want people today to understand and respond to the Lotus Sutra's true spirit. It was with this basic intention that I decided to write this commentary. The second reason for my decision to write this book is as follows. We cannot understand the Lotus Sutra by reading just part of its text. The Lotus Sutra is both a profound spiritual teaching and a literary masterpiece that feels like a theatrical drama. So we will not grasp its true meaning unless we read it completely from beginning to end. It is no easy task, however, to read an entire sutra written in difficult language with unfamiliar terminology and still grasp its meaning. People today need a commentary that they can readily understand. Because the Lotus Sutra is a literary masterpiece, we must respect its classical form. But even when explained in easily accessible language, the Lotus Sutra possesses a remarkable ability to work its way into our hearts. While my goal is to encourage you to read the Lotus Sutra, you will be able to understand it even better if you use this book as a companion text to the sutra. I also believe that even by reading only this commentary, you will gain a good grasp of the Lotus Sutra's fundamental principles. If you appreciate the true spirit of the Lotus Sutra and recite its most important passages every morning and evening, its teachings will take root in your heart. I have no doubt that the truth of the Lotus Sutra will manifest in your daily life, opening up a new way of life and a brighter future. So, to the readers of this commentary on the Lotus Sutra, I would like to say that I wrote it with great hope and a firm belief in your new life. Introduction: The development and spread of the Lotus Sutra. In the preface, I touched on the reasons for the Lotus Sutra's appearance, but here I would like to describe in greater detail both the process of its development and the course of its transmission across Asia. In the India of Shakyamuni's day, the use of writing was not widespread, so his teachings were memorized and transmitted orally. In a time when information could be preserved only through memory, people possessed extraordinary powers of memorization, far beyond what we can imagine. People's lives in those days were also not as bustling and complicated as they are today, and Shakyamuni's disciples, their minds calm and clear, treasured his every word. Because they were so intensely focused, we can be sure they never misheard his teachings. In addition, after the passing of Shakyamuni, his disciples convened several councils to check for mistakes in their understanding and to corroborate and correct their memories, thereby standardizing Shakyamuni's expositions of the Dharma. Even though the teachings were preserved by memory and transmitted orally, the words of Shakyamuni Buddha were accurately retained. We know that Shakyamuni spent as many as 50 years teaching people and traversing the vast terrain of northern India until the arches of his feet became as flat as boards. He expounded the Dharma countless times and, as I described previously, he used various methods to explain his teachings in ways best suited to each individual. Therefore, not only did the grasp of Shakyamuni's teaching differ from region to region and group to group, but interpretations and ways of expressing the Dharma inevitably changed with the passage of time. Each and every sutra, whether the Agama Sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Amitabha Sutra, or any of the numerous other sutras, expounds valuable wisdom. But what the Lotus Sutra did for the first time was to express and clearly explain Shakyamuni's foundational principles and unify every teaching he gave during his entire life. Put another way, the Lotus Sutra contains the essence of Shakyamuni's teachings and expresses it with clarity and heart. Some people, mistakenly supposing that Shakyamuni's teachings can be differentiated as superior or inferior, have debated the relative merits of the various sutras. This is a gross misunderstanding. Shakyamuni did not actually compile any of the sutras himself. During the nearly 50 years from his first exposition of the Dharma to the 5 ascetics at Deer Park near Varanasi, to the time he entered nirvana at the age of 80, Shakyamuni addressed countless numbers of people and expounded the Dharma untold times. Various groups of disciples and their students of later generations created compilations of these countless Dharma talks that they themselves had heard or that had been handed down to them, and these collections became the various sutras. Shakyamuni Buddha, who comes shining through all of these sutras, is the identical, honored one, bathing all of us with the light of the very same wisdom, no matter which sutra we revere. Therefore, although the Lotus Sutra is certainly Shakyamuni's greatest teaching, we do not need to diminish the value of other sutras in order to praise the Lotus Sutra. Symbolic expression. The Lotus Sutra was compiled in a dramatic, theatrical format so that the people of the time could better understand it. Its compilers strove to make abstract, intangible ideas accessible by expressing them in tangible forms. For instance, in Chapter 1 of the Lotus Sutra, Introductory, when Shakyamuni emits light from the tuft of white hair between his eyebrows and illuminates the 18,000 worlds in the eastern portion of the cosmos, Buddhas and their disciples become visible everywhere. This description symbolically expresses the truth that Buddhas can be found not just on Earth, but also on any other planets or heavenly bodies throughout the entire universe. Scenes of the earth quaking and flowers raining down are also symbolic expressions. Even in contemporary language, we often use idioms such as, "I was so scared that my blood ran cold," or, "It was so funny I laughed my head off." If we think about this for a moment, we realize that no matter how terrifying something is, our blood is not actually going to run cold, and even if you say, It was so funny I laughed my head off. You do not actually lose your head. At most, you might experience a good belly laugh. Nobody takes these metaphors or analogies literally, but, while they may not be actual fact, they succeed quite well in graphically conveying the truth of the speaker's feelings and experiences. This difference is key to understanding the Lotus Sutra. What is important is not the actual literal fact, but the truth that these kinds of metaphors and symbolism express. The Buddha teaches us truth. Therefore, no matter how improbable the literal content of the sutra, what matters most is gaining a firm grasp of the deeper truth that lies beneath the surface of its words. Kumarajiva's translation of the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra was transmitted to China and translated into Chinese by several monks, but the version of the text commonly read today was translated by Kumarajiva. His father, Kumarayana, came from a noble Indian family, but traveled to Kucha, an ancient country located in what today is western China, where he married a sister of the king. Kumarajiva was born there in 344. Buddhism was extremely successful in Kucha, and, when Kumarajiva was 7 years old, he was ordained and entered a monastery along with his mother. Later, he traveled to India to study, where he learned the Mahayana tradition. His teacher, Shuryasoma, recognized Kumarajiva's superior talent and character and gave him a copy of the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma, before Kumarajiva left to return home to Kucha. Laying his right hand on Kumarajiva's head, Shuryasoma gave him this instruction. The light of the Buddha wisdom has set in the west, but its twilight is now about to illuminate the east. This text possesses a karmic connection with the northeast. Faithfully disseminate it there. Today, when we reflect on Shuryasoma's words, karmic connection with the northeast, we recognize their profound significance. I am deeply moved by the fact that later, in Japan, far to the northeast of India, this text we know as the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma blossomed in all its glory. Kumarajiva followed his teacher's instructions, resolving to dedicate his life to spreading the Lotus Sutra in China to the northeast. In those days, China was plagued by chaos and frequent wars, however, and, as kingdoms rose and fell, the transmission of the sutra did not progress as Kumarajiva had intended. Kumarajiva's resounding fame as a translator preceded him, and, after a state known as the Later Qin arose, Kumarajiva accepted the invitation from its king and traveled to the capital Chang'an around 401, and spent the remaining years of his life working as a national teacher, tirelessly translating various sutras into Chinese. For Kumarajiva, the Lotus Sutra was certainly the most important of all the texts he translated. Errors plagued previous Chinese translations of the Buddhist sutras, so Kumarajiva proceeded with extreme caution, taking the task of translating the Lotus Sutra as seriously as if his life depended on it. Even though Kumarajiva had an excellent command of Indian languages and Chinese, he refrained from translating the text by himself. Instead, he assembled a large team of scholars conversant in the languages of both cultures and gave lectures on the Lotus Sutra to the king and to Chinese Buddhist monks. The team of scholars used their notes from these lectures to make their own translations of the Lotus Sutra. After carefully comparing all their individual versions and engaging in rigorous debates, they eventually completed a standard, definitive Chinese translation of the sutra. As many as 2,000 people seem to have been involved in this project. Therefore, even though Kumarajiva's version of the Lotus Sutra is a translation from an original Sanskrit manuscript, we can justifiably conclude that he and his team imparted to us the teachings of Shakyamuni with practically no errors. Here is a story that illustrates the brilliance of Kumarajiva's translation of the Lotus Sutra. King Yaojing of the Later Qin held the genius of Kumarajiva in such high regard that he wanted to preserve Kumarajiva's talent for posterity by having him father children. So he forced Kumarajiva to take a wife. Looking back on this episode from his deathbed, Kumarajiva made a vow. I reluctantly broke the precepts and took a wife, but I believe that nothing I have said has ever contradicted the intentions of the Buddha. If this is indeed true, when my body is cremated, may my tongue survive the flames. According to this tradition, when Kumarajiva was cremated, His tongue did indeed survive the flames, appearing among the ashes as if sitting atop a blue lotus, emitting a brilliant light, revitalizing the spirit of the Lotus Sutra. Subsequently, the Lotus Sutra became a central pillar of Chinese Buddhism because of the work of the little Shakyamuni, Shiryi, also known as the great teacher of Mount Tiantai. After mastering all of the Mahayana, as well as non-Mahayana texts, Shiryi was convinced that the Lotus Sutra contained the ultimate intention of the Buddha. Shiryi wrote excellent commentaries on the Lotus Sutra, including the profound meaning of the Lotus Sutra, words and phrases of the Lotus Sutra, and the Great Calming in Contemplation. Shiryi's commentaries contributed significantly to the Lotus Sutra's increasing popularity throughout China. Shortly thereafter, the Lotus Sutra was transmitted to Japan via the Korean peninsula. The Kumarajiva translation of the Lotus Sutra reached Naniwa, contemporary Osaka, in 577, and 38 years later, Prince Shotoku authored his commentary on the Lotus Sutra, the first Japanese exegesis of the text. Prince Shotoku's work is considered the oldest Japanese book. Prince Shotoku also composed his famous 17-article constitution based on the Lotus Sutra's ideas. This constitution was Japan's first code of national law, establishing moral tenets for fostering humaneness in Japan. Without exaggeration, this marks the first flowering of civilization in Japan. Accordingly, we should never forget the fact that the dawn of Japanese civilization was inspired by the true spirit of the Lotus Sutra. For more than 1400 years since that time, the spirit of the Lotus Sutra has been handed down in Japan from generation to generation. Later, Saicho, founder of the Tendai Buddhist sect, Dogen, founder of the Soto sect of Zen Buddhism, and many others worked to spread the teachings of the Lotus Sutra. Nichiren, in particular, made championing the Lotus Sutra his life's work, revitalizing the tradition of the text and the practice of its teaching. Buddhism has gradually lost its dynamism after the passing of Shakyamuni, but the emergence of the Lotus Sutra energized the tradition 700 years later. Curiously, the same thing occurred again 700 years after Prince Shotoku, when Nichiren appeared on the scene to revitalize the teachings of the Lotus Sutra. In the 700 years following the death of Nichiren, the true spirit of the Lotus Sutra was almost entirely lost, as his tradition gradually became a mere shell of its former self. Over time, people began to embrace the belief that they could obtain liberation simply by persistently chanting the Odaimoku, taking refuge in the Lotus Sutra by reciting the Japanese phrase Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, or that all their prayers would be answered if they revered only the Lotus Sutra mandala, composed of the Chinese characters inscribed by Nichiren. The content of the Lotus Sutra is invaluable. The spirit of the Lotus Sutra is invaluable. Putting the teachings of the Lotus Sutra into practice is invaluable. By understanding the sutra, having faith in it, and practicing its teachings in our everyday lives, we can gradually attain a state of mind in which all manner of distress and suffering no longer hinder us. We begin to get along better with the people around us, and we develop a spirit of service to others. If we feel these changes in ourselves for even just a few hours a day, our physical well-being and the environment around us will naturally improve. I believe that this kind of transformation is true liberation from suffering. The ultimate ideal and hope expressed in the Lotus Sutra is that all human beings in the world may have this experience and live together in peace and happiness. The Lotus Sutra is truly a teaching of respect for the sanctity of life, attainment of the human ideal of perfection, and achievement of world peace. It is essentially a humanistic teaching. Today, more than 700 years since the passing of Nichiren, we have an opportunity to rediscover the spirit of the teachings of the Lotus Sutra and to go on to build better lives for ourselves, our families, communities, and the world. The structure of the Threefold Lotus Sutra. The Threefold Lotus Sutra consists of 3 texts: the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma, and the Sutra of the Method for Contemplating the Bodhisattva Universal Sage. Introductory, main, and applicational sections of the Buddhist Sutras. Dividing a sutra into 3 parts for the purposes of analysis was a common practice that requires a brief explanation. The introductory section of the sutra tells when, where, and for whom the sutra was taught, as well as why it was taught, and it also offers a basic account of the sutra's significance. The introductory section works as a key to unlock the main section of the text that follows. The main section is the primary discourse of the sutra, the portion in which its most important ideas are explained. The applicational section describes the merits of understanding, having faith in, and practicing the teachings of the sutra's main section. It encourages people to embrace and share the sutra, and promises protection for those who endeavor to do so. The Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. The Sutra of Innumerable Meanings serves as a preface to the Lotus Sutra, and the two texts are considered inseparable. Both sutras identify Divine Eagle Peak, Mount Gridhrakuta, as the location for their expositions, and the Lotus Sutra tells us that Shakyamuni delivered the sutra immediately after finishing the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. The Threefold Lotus Sutra is also much better understood when we begin by reading the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings. Because of this relationship, the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings is also referred to as the opening sutra of the Threefold Lotus Sutra. In the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, Shakyamuni explains the intent of his teachings and the order in which he has given them up to that time. He also declares to his disciples that in more than 40 years of sharing the Dharma, he has not yet fully revealed the truth. We should be careful here not to misconstrue these words to mean that everything Shakyamuni has taught up to this point was somehow not the truth. All of Shakyamuni's teachings are true, but what he means here is that he has not yet fully revealed the truth in its entirety. He refrained from doing so because people's faith and understanding had not reached a level of maturity that would allow them to fully accept and grasp the truth to its full extent. Shakyamuni then makes the great promise, "I will now explain everything in full detail," and, as you may already know, the exposition of the Dharma he gave immediately following the conclusion of the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings is none other than the Lotus Sutra. For this reason, if you do not read the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, you will not clearly understand the place of the Lotus Sutra among all the teachings that Shakyamuni revealed during his lifetime, and consequently, you will not understand the true significance of the Lotus Sutra. The sutra's title indicates a teaching that possesses a countless number of meanings. Shakyamuni goes on to explain that the teaching that possesses innumerable meanings arises from just one truth. This one truth, moreover, is the state of having no attributes. But since the sutra does not explain this in detail, its meaning is left unclear. This ambiguity is resolved in Shakyamuni's next teaching, the Lotus Sutra, in which he describes the meaning of having no attributes in wide-ranging detail. Since the teaching of innumerable meanings ultimately boils down to the truth taught in the Lotus Sutra, the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings reveals that the Lotus Sutra is the most essential body of teachings expounded during Shakyamuni's lifetime. The Sutra of Innumerable Meanings contains 3 chapters: the virtuous practices, expounding the Dharma, and 10 merits. The virtuous practices is the sutra's introductory section, expounding the Dharma is its main section, and 10 merits is its applicational section. The Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma. The next text of the Threefold Lotus Sutra is the Sutra of the Lotus Flower of the Wondrous Dharma, or simply the Lotus Sutra, which comprises the following 28 chapters. Chapter 1, Introductory. Chapter 2, Skillful Means. Chapter 3, A Parable. Chapter 4, Faith and Understanding. Chapter 5, The Parable of the Medicinal Herbs. Chapter 6, Giving Assurance of Buddhahood. Chapter 7, The Parable of the Conjured City. Chapter 8, The Assurance of Buddhahood given to the 500 disciples. Chapter 9, The Assurance given to those trained and still in training. Chapter 10, Teachers of the Dharma. Chapter 11, The Appearance of the Jeweled Stupa. Chapter 12, Devadatta. Chapter 13, Encouragement to Hold Firm. Chapter 14, Peaceful and Agreeable Practices. Chapter 15, Springing Up Out of the Earth. Chapter 16, The Lifespan of the Eternal Tathagata. Chapter 17, Specification of Merits. Chapter 18, The Merits of Rejoicing. Chapter 19, The Merits of the Teachers of the Dharma. Chapter 20, The Bodhisattva Never Unworthy of Respect. Chapter 21, The Transcendent Powers of the Tathagata. Chapter 22, The Entrustment. Chapter 23, The Former Deeds of Bodhisattva Medicine King. Chapter 24, The Bodhisattva Wondrous Sound. Chapter 25, The Bodhisattva regarder of the sounds of the world is Universal Gateway. Chapter 26, Dharanis. Chapter 27, The Former Deeds of King Wondrous Adornment. And Chapter 28, Encouragement from the Bodhisattva Universal Sage. In addition to dividing a Buddhist sutra into the 3 sections discussed above, monks and scholars have historically partitioned the Lotus Sutra in additional ways in order to understand it better. The most common is dividing the sutra into 2 halves. The half from Chapter 1, Introductory, to Chapter 14, Peaceful and Agreeable Practices, is called the Manifest Dimension, and the remainder of the text is called the Original Dimension. Next, the 2 dimensions of the text are each subdivided into introductory, main, and applicational sections. Within the Manifest Dimension, Chapter 1, Introductory, forms the introductory section, and the main section begins with Chapter 2, Skillful Means, and extends to Chapter 9, the assurance given to those trained and still in training. The applicational section consists of Chapter 10, Teachers of the Dharma, to Chapter 14, Peaceful and Agreeable Practices. Similarly, in the Original Dimension, the first half of Chapter 15, Springing Up Out of the Earth, is considered the introductory section. The main section consists of the second half of Chapter 15, Chapter 16, the Lifespan of the Eternal Tathagata, and the first half of Chapter 17, Specification of Merits. The remainder of the sutra is considered the applicational section of the Original Dimension. Manifest and Original Dimensions, Manifest and Original Buddhas. At this point, we must consider the differences between the Manifest and Original Dimensions of the Lotus Sutra. The Manifest Dimension, the first half of the sutra, is the teaching of the Manifest Buddha. This term, Manifest Buddha, refers to the world-honored one Shakyamuni, who was born into the world as a human being, attained Buddhahood through the practice of ascetic and spiritual disciplines, and passed away at the age of 80. The Manifest Dimension contains the teachings of the historical Buddha, based on his own experience of achieving Buddhahood, a state of personal perfection or supreme perfect awakening. These teachings reveal the truth of how all things come into existence and the meaning of what it is to be human. They explain how human beings should live and relate to one another. Shakyamuni taught that wisdom is most important for maintaining our humanity and preserving the proper state of human relationships. The wisdom of the Buddha is the heart of the Manifest Dimension. The Original Dimension, the second half of the sutra, centers on Chapter 16, in which Shakyamuni declares that since the infinite past, he has always been present everywhere throughout the universe, continually expounding the Dharma, teaching and transforming all living beings, and leading them to Buddhahood. We may be astonished by Shakyamuni's statement, but it is really not surprising at all. The Buddha is, in the ultimate sense, universal truth, which is the fundamental principle that animates all things, including the stars in the sky and the planets in our solar system, as well as the plants and animals on Earth, including human beings. We could think of universal truth as the fundamental dynamism of the universe. As universal truth, the Buddha has permeated the entire universe since the infinite past. This is what is meant by the term, the original Buddha. The historical Buddha Shakyamuni, the manifest Buddha, is actually an appearance of the original Buddha in our world, manifested in human form. We can better understand the relationship of these 2 aspects of the Buddha by thinking about the interdependence of radio, television, or cell phone signals, and the devices that receive these transmissions. Even though we are surrounded by such signals, we cannot see, hear, or touch them. But it is a fact that these signals fill the space around us. This is precisely why, when you turn on a radio or television and set your dial to the appropriate channel, or when you turn on cell phones that are programmed to pick up the proper cell phone network, the results are sounds and images that we can listen to or watch. Metaphorically speaking, the original Buddha is like the person speaking to us from the broadcast center, as well as the broadcast signal that fills all the space around us. The manifest Buddha is the voice or image that we can see or hear from the radio, television, or cell phone speaker. Without the original signal, we would not receive any images or voices. Likewise, if there were no original Buddha, the manifest Buddha would not appear. Conversely, just as we cannot receive a signal as sounds and images without a radio, television, or cell phone, We would not become aware of the original Buddha if it were not for the manifest Buddha. The original Buddha is universal truth, present everywhere throughout the cosmos, from the infinite past into the infinite future. Through the teachings of Shakyamuni, who appeared in our world as the embodiment of the truth, humanity could, for the first time, comprehend this truth, the original Buddha. The original Buddha and the manifest Buddha are equally indispensable. We need both and cannot separate one from the other. To continue the analogy, radio and television stations broadcast in the hope that as many listeners and viewers as possible turn on their devices and receive the signal. In this same way, the original Buddha continually permeates the universe with compassion, transforming and liberating all living beings everywhere. By liberate, I do not mean liberation or salvation in the sense of sending out a life raft to save people from drowning. Rather, liberation means making it possible for everything that exists to manifest its own original vitality. The original Buddha makes it possible for all things, including all living beings, to unlock their fullest potential. Let's call this the original Buddha's liberation of all living beings, the force that enables us to tirelessly progress toward the realization of our human and spiritual potential. The original Buddha is none other than universal truth, and therefore anyone, for any reason, can turn on that switch and adjust their way of living in order to tune in to the signal of universal truth. When this happens, the Buddha is immediately present, assuring us that the clouds of delusion covering our minds and blanketing our bodies will dissipate, and that from within us the brilliant light of our latent vitality will shine forth. This is what I mean by true liberation. The original Buddha is timeless. Always in our world, the original Buddha has no beginning and no end, and so is ever present, manifesting in whatever form is appropriate to the time and place, to transform living beings according to their capacities for understanding the truth. The original dimension of the Lotus Sutra describes the relationship between the Buddha and human beings. It shows us the liberating transformation we can attain through the original Buddha. This liberation is nothing less than the workings of the Buddha's compassion. The heart of the original dimension of the Lotus Sutra is the compassion of the Buddha. The Sutra of the Method for Contemplating the Bodhisattva Universal Sage. The Sutra of the Method of Contemplating the Bodhisattva Universal Sage is a teaching that Shakyamuni is said to have given following the Lotus Sutra at the Great Forest Monastery near Vaishali in central India. The sutra is an extension of the final chapter of the Lotus Sutra, encouragement from the Bodhisattva Universal Sage. The purpose of the Sutra for Contemplating Universal Sage is to teach us how to practice acknowledgement and remorse, a practical method for embodying the true spirit of the Lotus Sutra. By reading the Lotus Sutra, we gain awareness of the profound intention behind every teaching that Shakyamuni gave throughout his life, and we realize that we, too, can become Buddhas. This brings us a surge of indescribable courage to live our lives fully. But the reality of daily life is that there are days when distress and suffering assault us every passing moment, and we sometimes feel powerless to resist a variety of harmful habits and behaviors. These feelings may cause our newfound courage to flounder. Intellectually, we understand our capability to become Buddhas, but we still don't know how to deal with doubt and confusion. Even as we struggle to clear away these emotions, the clouds once again bear down on us. Practicing acknowledgement and remorse is how we dispel these clouds, and the Sutra for Contemplating Universal Sage teaches us how to perform this practice. As with the opening sutra, the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, this text is also inseparable from the Lotus Sutra, commonly called the Sutra of Acknowledgement and Remorse. It is thought of as the conclusion to the Lotus Sutra, as well as the closing sutra of the entire Threefold Lotus Sutra. We are now ready to study the Threefold Lotus Sutra. Following the order of its three texts, we will begin by exploring the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings.